It's time to tune in to Defending the Faith with Frank Harber. Hear the latest about religious liberty.
A win for religious freedom in one of the remaining blockbuster cases facing the U.S. Supreme Court this term.
A legal battle continues for the Little Sisters of the Poor for nearly a decade now.
A street preacher armed with a speaker, a microphone, and a camera strapped to his chest is now banned from the village.
Our founding fathers believed in the separation of church and state, but not for one fleeting moment did they believe in the separation of God and government.
And powerful apologetics. Are you prepared to defend the faith?
I'm convinced unless we trust in God, this nation is finished.
We're facing a new kind of enemy. We're involved in a new kind of warfare, and we need the help of the Spirit of God.
3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Defending the Faith. I am Frank Harber. I am your host. I am the Chief Legal Counsel for Defending the Faith Alliance. We defend the faith. We defend the faith in the legal arena, but we also defend the faith in the theological arena. We are about strengthening Christians, helping Christians. I represent churches, pastors, denominations across the country, and we try to bring things to our listeners that we believe will be of a great benefit, that will strengthen your walk in the times that we live in turbulent times. And I can't think of anything that is more needed today in the kind of times that we live in than prayer. And so in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our special guest, Dr. Dan Crawford, and he's going to talk to us about the vital role of prayer. But before I do, if you're tuning in for the first time, you can find us online at defendingthefaith.law. And you can find out about what we're doing at the Alliance. We have many different cases. I'm about to be in Kentucky in 2 weeks, defending a religious liberty case. We have cases in Alabama right now, all across the country. We also have free resources on there, so you can find out about us and find out and catch up on podcasts and shows that we've done, defendingthefaith.law. Well, today it is my privilege to introduce a very special guest, Dr. Dan Crawford. And Dr. Crawford was my professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so I was saved in 1987. And in 1989, I enrolled in Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And somehow I got it in my head that I was supposed to be an evangelist. I wanted to be an evangelist. And they had a class back then. I think it has a different name now, but it was called Spring Evangelism Practicum. And so if you signed up for this class, they would let you preach a revival. And, you know, what a thing to get asked to preach at somebody's church when a whole bunch of us didn't get asked to preach at anybody's church. And so I signed up for this class, and I had to do a special interview with Dr. Crawford. And so he assigned me 2 revivals. And so I remember the first revival was in Wichita, Kansas, and then I went to Topeka, Kansas. And it was such an amazing time. That was one of the best classes I ever had. And if you talk to any seminary student who's ever had that class, they'll tell you about a transformational experience. Thousands of people have went through this, and they all will have stories like me. And it's probably the main reason that I became an evangelist, because I had such a successful time, and we baptized a bunch of people, and amazing things happened during that week. I would go on and become a full-time vocational evangelist doing crusades in churches. I did many area-wide crusades and stadium crusades and such, but it all started because of this guy right here to my right. He went to Payne University. I'm going to let him tell us about it. So I'm going to guess at some of these details. I know he was a BSU director, and he'll tell us what BSU stands for. Dr. Crawford, welcome to the show. Tell us about who you are.
Oh, well, BSU is no longer. It was Baptist Student Union. Yeah. It is now, in Texas at least, Baptist Student Ministries. I was a pastor of a church going through seminary, actually pastored a church in college, pastored another church while I was in seminary. But my wife had a good experience in her university days, and she told me actually on our first date that she was going to marry a Baptist campus minister. And I just kind of wrote that off, but she was right. And she's been right ever since, in fact.
Her name's Joanne, is that right?
Joanne.
Yep.
So
hey, Joanne, if you're watching.
I resigned my church when I graduated from seminary. I went to be the Baptist student minister and Bible teacher at Pan American University, which is now the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And then 3 years at East Texas State, which is now Texas A&M Commerce. Yeah. Then University of Texas. I was there for 6 years. Then on to the North American Mission Board, which was then Home Mission Board. A lot of places I've been, they changed the name after I left. I don't know what that means.
I'm worried about Southwestern Seminary when you leave. Yeah.
Then to Southwestern Seminary, 22 years on the faculty. Now my title is Senior Professor of Evangelism and Missions, Chair of Prayer Emeritus, and I am retired.
Well, he's still up there teaching, and I know they have him up there doing things. He's got an office, so you need to stop by and see him, especially if you're a former student. So tell us what you're preaching these days, and I think you're an interim pastorate right now.
I'm an interim pastor at Trinity Hills Baptist Church in Benbrook. That's my 26th interim pastorate, and it's just going great. I love being an interim pastor. Dr. Fish told me when I became a faculty member, get all your interims a long ways away. You'll work less, and they'll pay you more. So this one's 8 miles from the house. You can figure it out. They're about to drive me crazy going to meetings.
Well, I used to be on faculty at Southwestern, and I was a colleague of Dr. Crawford, and so we have many, many good stories and times. But being a student under him, one of the things that I quickly grasped was this is a man of prayer. He knows about prayer. I think he probably knows more about prayer than anybody I know. So tell us, how did this prayer journey begin? How did you come to know so much about prayer? You've read a lot of books on prayer.
Well, my mother was a prayer warrior. Long before I knew anything about spiritual gifts, I knew my mother had the gift of intercessory prayer. My dad was the pastor. She always seemed to know things before he did. And I thought that was kind of strange until I began to realize what intercessors do. They talk to God all the time. My mother was a great prayer warrior. She was a teacher of prayer. She lived it at the house. My dad prayed all the time. So I just came by it naturally, I guess. I didn't go to the seminary to teach prayer. I went to teach evangelism. A couple of semesters in, the man that was teaching the course on prayer got sick and couldn't finish the semester. And I made a tragic mistake, as some would think. In a faculty meeting, I asked who was going to finish his class. And they all looked at me, and that settled that question. So I finished teaching at that semester, and he never came back. And under Dr. Hemphill's presidency, I became the occupant of the Chair of Prayer, which there are only 2 of those in the world, fully endowed chairs of prayer.
Wow.
And so in addition to evangelism and the revival practicum and some missions courses, I taught the course on prayer.
That is incredible. And he's written all kinds of books on prayer. We're going to tell you where to get some of these books at the end of this episode. But Dr. Crawford, talk to us. Maybe some people, they don't value prayer real highly. They don't think about it too much. Why pray? Why should we pray?
The short answer is the Bible teaches it. Jesus modeled it. History encourages it, and our lives require it. Now, let me break that down for you. The Bible teaches it. Somebody counted them. I haven't counted them, but somebody counted and said there were 450 prayers in the Bible, not counting Psalms, which is, some would say, a book of prayer. But obviously, it starts in Genesis. It goes all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. The Bible teaches it. Jesus modeled it. Jesus was praying at his baptism. He was praying on the cross. Again, some have said that the verb to pray is the most used verb in the ministry of Jesus. So what's he doing now? Well, the writer of Hebrews says he lives to make intercession for us. So he's still praying.
Wow.
Jesus modeled it.
That's good.
History encourages it. We don't have time probably for all those stories, but there are dozens and dozens of great stories on prayer in history that encourages people to pray. And then our lives require it. For believers, prayer is, for believers, relationship. What keeps a relationship strong? Communication. And so what keeps our relationship with the Lord strong? Our communicating with him. Our lives require it. That's the long and short answer.
Now, you mentioned some stories about prayer. Do you have any stories for us? You're great at telling stories.
more than you have time for. But September 23rd, 1857, Old North Dutch Church on Manhattan Island. They were without a pastor. People were moving off Manhattan Island. The church was dying. They didn't know what to do. They hired a Presbyterian businessman by the name of Jeremiah Lanpier. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't ministerial. He just decided to have a prayer meeting, and he announced a businessman's prayer meeting would meet at noon on that Wednesday. 6 men showed up. They prayed first for Manhattan Island, but then they prayed for spiritual awakening in the world. It wasn't long until every church on Manhattan Island had a praying group at noon on Wednesdays, and that prayer meeting began a revival. It spread from Manhattan Island to Brooklyn, down the eastern seaboard, and across the Appalachian Mountain Range. And after 8 months, they said somewhere in the vicinity of 250,000 conversions.
Wow.
That's an ancient story. The more up-to-date one is the church where I'm a member, Wedgwood Baptist Church in Fort Worth. September the 15th, 1999, we had a lone gunman walk in there. See you at the pole rally. He had 2 guns and 2 rounds of ammunition and a homemade pipe bomb, and he made a mess out of things, killed 7, wounded 7 seriously, traumatized hundreds, including members of my family. People all over the world prayed for us. Our pastor said we might have been the most prayed for church since the New Testament. We don't know that for sure, but a lot of people prayed for us. And the first full year after the shooting, where you turn in that church letter, where you give them numbers for everything, numbers of worship attendance, numbers in Bible study, numbers in the music program, all those numbers reached an all-time high in the history of that church in the year following the shooting. We only had one way to explain that, and that was that people interceded on our behalf. The church grew. There were 800 people before the shooting, the Sunday before. 6 months later, we were having 1,200 people.
Now, if you're a disciple, I think part of that call to be a disciple is prayer. And you've written on this, the prayer-shaped disciple. Can you talk about that?
Well, that was the textbook we used at seminary on the course in prayer. I'd written an earlier book called Disciple Shape, and the publishers wanted a sequel to it on prayer, somehow tying it into the title. And I wrote the book. We didn't have a title. And I went on a 3-week prayer journey around the world with the International Mission Board. And we prayed through China and India and Yemen and out through Western Europe. And when I got back, I was in a meeting and they introduced me. He said, he just went on a prayer walk around the world. And this guy said, well, you must be in good shape. And I said, no. They flew, and they walked in places. And he said, well, I guess he's in prayer shape. And all of a sudden we had a title, Prayer-Shaped Disciple. And by the way, it is now being translated into Spanish. I've just taken on another responsibility to teach young pastors in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas about discipleship, and we're getting that book into Spanish for them.
Now, you mentioned prayer walking. So what is prayer walking?
Prayer walking is a method. It's not in the Bible. You won't find a verse that says go prayer walk. And even the verses that people want to use to support it probably aren't about prayer walking. It's a method. The biblical principle is pray without ceasing, 1 Thessalonians. And how do you pray without ceasing? Well, one way is you pray while you're walking. So it became a popular thing, especially in cross-cultural ministries, where people walked and they prayed in their neighborhoods, in their cities, wherever they went. I took numerous groups of students all over the world to prayer walk with missionaries. You can prayer ride, you can prayer jog, you can prayer drive. Walking is not anything special. In fact, usually when I get asked to lead a seminar, they say, how long do you take? I said, well, I can take a long time or I can take 30 seconds. How long do you want? I mean, the 30-second version says, you know how to walk, you know how to pray, put them together. That's prayer walking.
Now, did you do something with Calvin Miller on prayer walking?
That was the 3-week trip around the world, and he was in that group along with Dr. Bob Garrett and Randy Sprinkle from the International Mission Board. We prayer walked around the world, And the book that we wrote was called Prayer Walking, A Journey of Faith. And he and I, Calvin Miller and I, co-authored that book. You try to co-author a book with Calvin Miller, that's a challenge of itself. Half of the book is a journal of that trip, and the other half is a how-to manual on prayer walking.
I tell you what, I miss him. He was, when he left Southwestern Seminary, that's whose position I took. And he was a Renaissance man. I mean, there was just, I've never met anybody like him since, and just really, really miss him. Now, you wrote another book, and I held it up just a second ago, Praying Through the Beatitudes. Tell us about that.
The Beatitudes are called by many things. They call them Discipleship 101, Christianity 101, and I like to call them the disciple's resume. And I challenge students to look at the Beatitudes, study the Beatitudes, which is your weakest one, and pray about that one, that God would strengthen you in that particular Beatitude. So, yeah, you can pray the Beatitudes. Praying Scripture is an old method. I saw a book recently about the new method of praying Scripture. Yeah, it's new. Jonah prayed 17 prayers out of the Psalms while he was in the belly of that fish, and 6 other books of the Bible he prayed. So Scripture praying is not very new. So praying through the Beatitudes is how the book was written is another interesting story. If you want it, I'll tell you that.
Oh, we got to hear it now. Well, we got to hear it.
Okay, COVID hit. The borders closed. All of a sudden, my invitations were getting canceled right and left. I had more whiteout than I had ink in my calendar. And I was sitting in my den one day, just kind of talking to God and thinking and not particularly praying. I was just sitting there. And I said, God, are you through with me? I mean, people are canceling me right and left. We can't go anywhere. Nobody wants to meet. What am I going to do now? And I looked up, and my wife had put some of my books on the mantle over the fireplace. And I looked up, and it was as if God spoke. He didn't, but he could have said this. And it was like he said, you don't have to go anywhere to write another book. So I wrote Praying Through the Beatitudes, and we were still in COVID. And then I wrote Praying Through the 7 Churches of Revelation and Beyond, and we still had COVID. So then I co-authored a book with my cousin, Dr. Vicki Gillum, who was a career public school counselor and longtime caregiver, and we wrote Crisis Care, Crisis Prayer, which is a book for caregivers. And then I was sitting in my office thinking, now what am I going to write? And I had over 500 books on prayer on my shelves. And I'm thinking, who wrote these books? I mean, I know some of the authors, but the majority of them, I don't even know these guys or gals. And I started flipping through them, and I had things underlined, pages folded down, highlighted and stuff, things that were highlighted before I bought the book. So I thought, well, let me just kind of collect these. So I started collecting the highlighted, underlined parts of the books, and all of a sudden I had 365. So I compiled a book entitled 1 Year of Thoughts on Prayer by authors you may or may not know. And I intentionally left out the authors that everybody knew and just people you probably never heard of. And it's just a daily reading of thoughts on prayer that people wrote. So that's where Prayer Through Disciple, Praying Through the Beatitudes started. But I also wrote 4 books during the COVID.
Wow.
Thankfully, we're getting out of COVID, and I've run out of things to write for a little while.
So now you're up at the seminary, you got an office. So the current president, Dr. Adam Greenway, was one of my students. He was my grader. He had him in personal evangelism. I think he might have been your student too.
He was one.
Was he a good student?
Straight A's. I sent him to preach revivals, just like I did a lot of you guys. I did not know this, but when he became president, he told me that when he was returning from a revival in New Mexico, where I sent him, and that's when he met his wife. And he was giving me partial credit for he and Carla meeting. They met on his way back from the airport, actually. The person that picked him up said, I need to make a hospital visit. Stop. Hospital lady comes in to visit the same room. She sees Adam and she says, excuse me, Dr. Greenway. And she says, are you a seminary student? He says, yes, ma'am. She said, are you married? And he said, no. She said, I have somebody for you to meet. Well, he didn't want to do that. She'd said the same thing to Carla. They end up meeting at her house for lunch, and the rest is history.
Now, I did not know that story.
I didn't either.
You've just blown me away.
He just told me you're partly to credit.
So, yeah, I know that. I knew that.
That's why I have a nice office now.
Wow. So I
was in a cubbyhole.
Well, I've seen Carla. You need a palace. So, wow, that's an incredible story. I know that somewhere in his M.Div, after I left the seminary, he started grading for Dr. McDowell, and he went up to Dr. McDowell one time and asked him. He said, "How do you know if you're in love?" And that's when Dr. McDowell knew something was up, and he said, "Well, you just know, Adam. I mean, you just know." So you're involved in prayer on many, many different levels, and you've helped a lot of people, a lot of organizations. But you're a part of the American National Prayer Committee. Can you tell us about that? What's happened and what's going on now?
America's National Prayer Committee was started in 1979. It's a cross-denominational group of people, several hundred of us actually in the group. And the actual purpose of the group is to provide collective servant leadership to the national prayer movement. So they just sort of are a collecting place where people, the only way you get into that group is you have a prayer ministry or you teach prayer or you've written a book on prayer. So everybody that meets in that group has a strong connection to prayer. And we just sort of pray for each other and support each other. National Day of Prayer is under that umbrella. So a lot of things. I've been a member for about 25 years. I'm currently what do we call this? Head of the team group for the teaching of prayer and theological education. We would call it chairman of the committee, but we don't have committees. So task force, I think is what they call it. Head of the task force for the teaching of prayer and theological education, which leads to that big book that I compiled. 80 chapters. It's a resource book on prayer. 80 chapters by 80 different authors, all of whom have some connection to prayer ministry, most of whom are not Baptist. So I jokingly said I had to retire before I could compile that book. In the preface, I say to whoever wants to read it, if I believed everything in this book, I could have written it myself. But I was putting together a resource book. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of chapters in there that I don't particularly agree with, but I wanted them in the book because it's a resource book on prayer. I had a pastor tell me when he picked it up, "Great, I got 80 new sermons." I said, "Brother, at some point you're going to get fired. I don't know where, but you start preaching through that book, you're going to get fired because they're not all what you believe." But it's what somebody believes, and we need to look at all the different types of praying. And so that was that was published for the National Prayer Committee.
I want to ask your opinion. Do you think, in America, the state of Christianity, one, do you think Christians pray enough? Two, do churches pray enough?
I don't think either one of them pray enough. We talk about it a lot more than we do it. In fact, I get intrigued and sometimes upset just watching the news when people say, "Thoughts and prayers coming your way." And I wonder, do they even know how to pray? I mean, I give them credit for thinking, but, do all these people that talk about praying for you really pray? And I work at it because when somebody says, "Would you pray for me?" I will make a mental note. And as soon as I can, without embarrassing them, I'll write it down so that I can actually pray for them if I'm going to promise to pray for somebody. But I don't think we do. And I think the evidence of that is what's going on in society. We stop talking to God. When you stop talking to God, God stops listening.
What if somebody says, "Dr. Crawford, I'm just not a spiritual person, so I just don't even feel like I can pray"?
Well, I think Jesus dealt with that when he told his disciples, "Just call me Abba." Abba was the term of endearment for little Hebrew babies. Our babies say Dada, and little Hebrew babies learn to talk by listening, and they hear sounds, and little Hebrew babies say Ab.
Yeah.
And they somehow connected that to their daddy, and it became Abba. And what Jesus said to his disciples was, "You can talk to me in baby talk." So you don't have to know a lot to talk to God. Just talk. But we somehow think that we've got to have special language. We got to do King James English or something. And people hear people pray in public and they think, well, I can never do that. So you can't until you try. So
praying in public might be different. There's that, story in the Bible where, the Pharisee prayed to himself. So we probably have to make sure that we're actually praying to God.
Well, we do pray to be heard.
Yeah.
When we pray in public, we got to get all the right phrases in there. And so sometimes I wonder how serious and sincere those prayers are.
But God is the object of prayer, and he's the power. And if we tap into that power, it can be life-changing. Can you give us some resources as we get to the end of the show that would help us, to be better about this?
Well, the textbook I wrote was Prayer Shaped Disciple. It's out of print, but there are places where you can find it. There's a website where it's free. You can check on free ebooks, and it'll give you the whole book. I wrote a book called, I mentioned, Prayer Walking, Journey of Faith, if anybody's interested in prayer walking. I wrote a book called Ambassadors on Mission. It was based on Ephesians 6, the armor of God, where when Paul gets through describing the armor, he says, pray for me that I may speak boldly. Okay, what's the ambassador on mission? That's the priority of prayer and proclamation, which is what Paul said, pray for me that I can preach boldly. The book I mentioned, National Prayer Committee, a resource book. If you don't mind reading a chapter every now and then that you don't agree with, that's a recommended book. It is online with the National Prayer Committee website. And the ones I told you that I wrote during the COVID. Any of those are available at Christian bookstores, but also if they're out of print, you can go to my website, discipleallnations.org. That's one word, discipleallnations.org. And up in the right-hand corner, it has free ebooks. You click on that, and there are about 8 or so books there that are out of print, and you can read them free, including the book I wrote on the Wedgwood shooting and the aftermath of that.
Oh,
it's
everybody should get that book.
It's out of print, but it's also on that website, free of charge.
Well, you've been listening to Dr. Dan Crawford, and this man has touched my life. So I remember after I went on Spring Evangelism Practicum, I became an officer for a club at the seminary. It was called the Fellowship of Vocational Evangelists. It was called FOVE. And, we would meet once in a while, and occasionally they would have a faculty member that would come and be the speaker. And I remember you came, and I still remember what you talked on. You talked on Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Right. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And that message changed my life and changed my direction and how I thought about things and what I did. Just very transformational. So any of these resources that you can get by him, or better still, if you can, get him, he's a busy guy, but to come to your church and to preach or talk about prayer, how would they get a hold of you to do that, Dr. Crawford?
Well, you want my phone number? I can give you my phone number. 817-637-4967. You can text or call me. We can work on it. I'm retired. I don't have a secretary, so I can do all that myself. But I go a lot of places, do a lot of things. The borders are opening up. I'm on the road again. Thank you, Willie, for that phrase. So let me hear from you.
This is the guy. And so, he's had thousands of students and thousands. We'll probably get all kinds of comments from people that was my professor and I love him so much. I know we're going to get a big response on this. We've loved having you. Please share this show with someone that because prayer is the key. Prayer is the connection that we have to God. And if we lose that connection, we are living life in the dark. We're walking in the dark. So this show is available on every network. We're on Pandora, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook. We're on everything. So please share this episode. We appreciate you tuning in to watch us. Be sure and find us at defendingthefaith.law. Sign up for our newsletter, and we will see you in the next episode.